Fabio Vighi teaches Italian and European cinema at Cardiff University in the UK. He is the author of Traumatic Encounters in Italian Film, Zizek, Beyond Foucault, and the upcoming book from Sublation entitled Emergency Capitalism, A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. Fabio, I am thrilled to introduce you to the Sublation audience and to be publishing your upcoming book.
Great.
I am a fan of yours. Thank you.
I'm also very happy to be publishing with you, Doug. It's a great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to this interview too.
Great. So what is emergency capitalism? Let's start
from the beginning. Let's begin from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So emergency capitalism is a concept that I've developed now for about 4 years, obviously starting in 2020. Maybe we can go back to that later. But the overall idea is that we are now in a system which relies on crisis. And it's a debt-based, hyper-financialized system that can only prolong itself, can only continue insofar as it can find alibis or scapegoats which are traumatic in nature, let's say. So it needs almost an endless series of emergencies, ideally global emergencies, to be able to reproduce itself. So it's really a matter of existential reproduction for the system, almost. It relies on that. And the reason why it relies on emergencies is that it depends very much on credit creation or debt, whichever way you want to look at it. But it relies on the creation of enormous amounts of out of nothing. It's ultimately mouse clicked, as they say, cash that is created out of nowhere on computer screens in banks, and especially central banks, the lenders and buyers of last resort. And it's pumped into the hyper-financialized system. But in order for this mechanism to happen, the system requires a kind of rationale. It requires reasons to do it. And the reasons are, as I said, an endless series of events that can be described as emergencies. And I think we've seen a few already over the last 4 years, and there really hasn't been a break. It's now we are existentially almost within this paradoxical situation where, in order for the system to continue to survive its own crisis, it needs these external emergencies. So emergencies that need to be experienced as some kind of potentially eschatological, cataclysmic, apocalyptic events, which provide alibis for the system to do what it's doing. It's right now even creating liquidity out of nowhere, creating cash out of nowhere, so that to sustain a system that is increasingly unable to sustain itself without these mechanisms.
After the economic crisis of 2008, that is what you're describing is exactly what happened. The state generated fictitious capital out of thin air to make the banks whole.
I know what you mean. It's fundamentally they invented QE, quantitative easing, and it's interesting also because they said, it's going to be just a temporary measure. We're going to do just one quantitative easing, and then we're going to stop. The system is going to go back to normal. We're going to rebalance the system, and then naturally it will just continue to go where to do what it normally does. Truth is that there was QE, then QE1, QE2, QE3. We ended up with QE infinity, what is known as QE infinity. In other words, the system is existentially dependent on quantitative easing, which is a way of providing the system with the necessary cash it needs to. And remember, it's credit created out of nowhere. It's in the form of debt injected into the system, but it's ultimately created on computer screens. And that's the novelty of our time, that the system can just not stand on its own feet anymore. It needs the constant help of this debt creating or credit creating mechanism.
Now, what is it that I have two questions, so I'm going to ask you the second one first. MMT, modern monetary theory, is, from my way of thinking, and I'm not an expert on it, but is basically advocating for quantitative easing to infinity. It has a theory of money that supposes that you can that through monetary manipulation and the creation of credit and debt, you can manage the contradictions within capitalism indefinitely. And
Yeah.
and it was popular with the Sanders campaign in the United States. Apparently, Sanders consulted with some MMT theorists on his economic policies. Is stopping quantitative easing to infinity being just an economic policy straight up?
Well, the problem we're facing now is that because we've relied so much on credit creation, because it's not the first time that we've been doing it for too long. We've created so much money that is not produced by the system itself. It's externally produced by literally out of nowhere, and that creates by itself creates inflation. It devalues the currency. If you add so much currency to the system, even if it's just to inflate the bubbles, the financial bubbles, eventually still translates as fiat currency devaluation.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with MMT, I think, is the same problem that we have with what we call deficit spending or Keynesianism, right? The idea that, yeah, we can borrow money as long as we invest it properly, we should be able to kickstart the economy again. But it's too late now. And the system no longer responds to that logic. The main reason for me is that the real economy is no longer productive. It's no longer as productive as it used to be. And there's an imminent, I think we've discussed it before, there's an imminent reason for it. The reason is that automation is replacing value-producing labor. So within the capitalist real economy. Hence, the necessity for the system to produce profits, not through its original formula, but through financialization, which eliminates the mediation of labor, because it's simply money creating more money, right? The system it's existentially tied to the creation of money out of money itself, without necessarily labor as a mediator. So MMT, as well as various forms of Keynesianism and post-Keynesianism, are out of time. They don't realize that the system has moved on and the real economy is no longer productive to the point that the system needs it to be productive. It's no longer productive to support the system. And it's pretty obvious. If you look at national debts, it's pretty obvious that these debts are growing exponentially. There's no way of stopping them, precisely because the returns from the real economy are not even enough to pay the interest of the public debt or the national debt. So the system requires, it's almost like an addict requiring more and more toxic drugs, essentially, right, to carry on, or methadone, or however you want to put it. It requires external measures to make it function. And so we are now totally dependent on fictitious capital. That's the point. Totally dependent on fictitious capital. There's no way we can reignite a value productive economy, because the value productive economy is based on intensive labor, intensive exploitation of labor. With the levels of technological innovation that we have today, from the third industrial revolution in the 70s to the fourth industrial revolution that is actually happening now with artificial intelligence, it's impossible to achieve the amount of value necessary for the reproduction of our societies. No, that's an imminent reason. It's got nothing to do with people being good or bad, managing the system. It's not about a matter of managing the system. It's the system itself that is self-destroying. It's slowly collapsing because it follows blindly its own internal logic, right? Profit making is the only thing that matters to capital, obviously. It's about the self-reproduction of itself. It's not about socializing people, communities, etc. It's about
so let me interject and see if I've got this right. No trouble. So you have the quantitative easing that came out of 2008. It was supposed to be a one-time measure, but it happened again and again. It is through the state and various mechanisms, simply the printing of money to and the lowering of interest rates in order to inject capital and inject money into various capitalist enterprises to keep investment and production going, right? It's just real simple terms. And the idea was, if we do this, then the production will keep going and then it will be profitable, and the loans, these are basically loans, will be paid back and there won't be a problem. But the difficulty is that even then, the rate of profit or the rate of the production of the surplus, which are two different things, was so low because of automation that the fictitious capital produced inflation instead of just setting the system right. And so with the inflation, you would have difficulty basically buying raw materials for production, and also have getting people gainfully employed, because the wages would have to either go up or the workers wouldn't be able to reproduce themselves. Just all sorts of difficulties arose around inflation. So that led to the rising interest rates, which meant that you couldn't get private industry to borrow the capital that you were the fictitious capital that you were introducing into the market. And so they had to come up with reasons for the state to borrow from itself in order to do something with the money, that the fictitious capital that was being produced. And that's why there was this emergency capitalism arose. Is that correct?
I think with first of all, the quantitative easing was the target of quantitative easing was mostly to keep the financial markets afloat, so to avoid an explosion in the financial markets, which would have translated as destruction also of the real economy, because by 2008, I would argue even earlier, the real economy had already been cannibalized or colonized by fictitious capital. So the real economy itself runs on borrowed money. And the borrowed money in the form of bonds or whatever is then placed on markets, and it's packaged into different, as we know, different types of financial assets, which are exchanged 100 times, and then they turn into derivatives, etc. So it's really a kind of pyramid of hot air, right? There's nothing in it. There's just a promise of future valorization eventually. So that's the way in which the financial markets predates or cannibalizes the real economy. And this is a mechanism that has been in place for a long time. So what I'm trying to say is that the economy as we understand it today is disproportionately the financial system. It's the center of gravity of what we call the capitalist economy today is the financial market. So the number one preoccupation of policymakers, etc., is to make sure that financial markets, that there isn't a violent downturn in financial markets, because that would really be traumatic for the whole of society, because we are connected, existentially connected to financial markets. So when you're talking about quantitative easing, ultimately the purpose was to keep those markets pumped with liquidity and allow those markets to expand again. And after COVID, of course, the system has been pumped with a lot of liquidity, so has been made liquid again with a lot of cash. And today we are in a situation where, again, the paradox we're living today, we have a number of countries, Japan, the UK, other countries that are actually in recession technically, and yet their financial markets are breaking record highs all the time. And that's the decoupling I'm talking about. What really matters, we need to realize that what really matters to what we call the elite is the protection of speculation, the protection of financial assets. The bubbles can't pop. If the bubbles pop, all hell breaks loose. That's the number one preoccupation. And I think even when we think about geopolitics, we should always go back to think about this context, that everything that takes place around us today is deeply connected with the health, in inverted commas, of financial markets, because they have become the economy. They have become the center of the economy. That doesn't mean that workers don't matter anymore. Of course they do. Commodity needs to be produced, etc., etc. There needs to be consumption and so on and so forth. But there's a massive distortion within the system insofar as capital is created, whether you consider it fictitious or not, capital is created in financial markets more than in the real economy. And because financial markets are now much more profitable than the real economy. So capitals flow naturally, spontaneously into the financial, into the stock markets and the bond markets, etc., and any other kind of market that is speculative in nature.
So I tend to think about the world through movies. I try to think about the world through books and literature and art, but I often enough it's Hollywood movies. And there are two movies that came to mind while you were describing this. One was Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts, and I forget the guy's name.
Richard Gere.
Richard Gere, yes, yeah. Richard Gere. And the other is Wall Street with Michael Douglas.
Oh yeah,
and Martin Sheen and Charlie Sheen and Daryl Hannah from Mermaid and Splash. But anyhow, in both those movies, the plot, there's a primary plot. Usually it's like a love story, or in Pretty Woman, certainly it's a love story. But the background plot is that you have these Wall Street types that are going around basically buying up real capital, real businesses, and just turning them into assets for financial speculation. They're destroyers of worlds, these Wall Street tycoons.
So what do you do?
I buy companies.
What kind of companies?
I buy companies that are in financial difficulty.
If they have problems, you must get them for a bargain, huh?
Well, the company I'm buying this week, I'm getting for the bargain price of about $1 billion.
So you don't actually have $1 billion, huh?
No, I get some of it from banks, investors. It's not an easy thing to do.
And you don't make anything?
No.
And you don't build anything?
No.
So what do you do with the companies once you buy them?
I sell them.
Here, let me do that. You sell them?
Well, I don't sell the whole company. I break it up into pieces, and then I sell that off. It's worth more than the whole.
So it's sort of like stealing cars and selling them for the parts, right?
We can look back as far back as like 1987 and see what you're talking about as far as the financial sector getting out of control. And it sort of defines neoliberalism, which is associated, of course, with the Reagan era, the 80s.
Yes.
But what also is associated with that time is the destruction of domestic production and the globalization of the economy and the seeking of cheap labor overseas. You have Wall Street comes out in 87. A movie like Roger and Me, made by Michael Moore, comes out in 89, which is all about the destruction of this automobile GM town, Flint, Michigan, as the jobs move from Flint to Mexico. So this is a story that's familiar, but what you're saying is that it's reached a fever pitch, that somehow or another, the aim of it's pretty usual for a business to borrow money for next year's production. So you borrow money, short-term loans or long-term loans, with the idea of taking the money, investing in production, and paying back the loan. And then you have all sorts of financial instruments that build on top of that basic transaction. But what you're saying is like the trading of speculative assets based on future production is pretty much a huge percentage of not the population of the economy. It takes up a huge space in the economic world.
Yeah, look at world economy. They are either stagnant or in recession or growing very little. Even China slowed down a lot. So even those economies that we thought of over the last years, that there's a lot of potential there in the real economy, in the labor-based economy. Even those economies are starting to slow down. And it's not just, and here you have two schools of thought, right? You think, okay, it's the Gordon Geckos of this world. It's greed that has taken over, right? Greed has taken over capitalism, as if capitalism wasn't greedy by definition. Right. This is the point that people miss when they personalize guilt, right? It's not just the Gordon Geckos of this world. It's the system that is intrinsically greedy. So it capital goes wherever it can accumulate itself more quickly. If the real economy is no longer so productive in terms of capital, then capital will move in financial market. That's what it's been doing over the last 50 years, I argue, probably starting in the 80s, really, maybe even a little earlier. And I make it, I argue that it coincides with the third industrial revolution, where we have all of a sudden microelectronics. And I'm not the only one arguing that, by the way. There's a lot of people, there's a very ample literature of thinkers who have underlined this. It's an imminent movement. It's got nothing to do with subjectivities, with greedy characters. Of course, it needs the greedy characters too to drive that logic towards the financialization of the economy, but it's intrinsic within the capitalist system, right? If it cannot profit from productive economy, from labor, it will profit from speculation. And I argue that neoliberalism and financialization of the economy was essentially almost like a compensatory move away from the growing lack of productivity of the real economy. That's my argument. And I think now we are the point of no return in a way. We cannot go back to those days where the economy was so productive. Because why was it productive? Because it was labor intensive. Because a lot of labor was employed in commodity production, which is really what creates value in capitalist terms, commodity production. Now it's machines producing commodities. Hence, really, it's just a very elementary application of Marxian theory. Hence, you, as a capitalist, produce less and less value. Value not only in economic terms, but also in social terms. Value as a social relation, as a relation that socializes labor and capital, right? So I think we are outside that framework now, and there's no way we can go back to that world.
So I want to, I think I agree with everything you're just saying, but I want to go through it again just to see if I'm getting it right. So the idea of capitalism is that everyone can be greedy. In fact, that's how it's supposed to work, right? Adam Smith talked about how private interests become public goods and through the hidden hand of the market. Right. And so we have what's good about capitalism is the way that it creates individual interests and lets people pursue their own happiness, and in a way where it doesn't have to be hierarchical or centralized or run by some authority, but everyone working in their own interests, producing, will create a better world for everybody. That's the idea. But then I had a friend who was a Marxist who used to say, there is a hidden hand of the market, but there's also a hidden foot. And the hidden foot is that what happens is what you're describing, where the more efficient you become, the faster you can produce things, the more machines you use, and it's called constant capital in Marxist terms or in economic terms, that is deployed, then the more likely you are to have trouble in terms of making a profit. The market will start to break down. And why is that? Why is it the faster we make things, the more efficient we are at producing things? The less work we have to do to make the world, the more trouble we get in the market, the less profits we make. Why is that happening?
It's a crazy thing, right? From my angle, automation and technological innovation is intrinsically a blessing. It's a blessing in disguise. But because it's attached to the capitalist formula, it drives us down. It creates depression. It creates stagnation, and it forces capitalism into the financial market, which are increasingly, that's a different story, but increasingly distorted by central banks, etc., etc. But the point is that the basic formula is money, labor, capital. Money invested into labor creates capital through the exploitation of labor. Surplus labor time creates surplus value for the capitalist, but at the same time, it socializes laborers. It creates a society out of that formula. And so we've seen that develop over the last, 200 years, maybe, even though we've maybe experienced it at its heights, mostly in the post-war period, right? From the 50s up to the 80s, the glorious 30 years of post-war, where there was a degree of redistribution of capital, laborers fought for their rights, and there was a kind of rebalancing of that greed in a way. But then let's not forget that happened mostly at the center. the capitalist center. It's not everywhere in the world, of course.
Mhm.
So there was still huge exploitation elsewhere, obviously, whilst all this. But anyway, the point being that the formula works for capital as well as for workers to an extent, only insofar as workers are employed. If machines are employed, you don't produce capital in capitalist, you don't produce value in capitalist terms anymore. You don't, because it's very simple. You don't pay productive workers anymore. You can't pay productive workers. You pay machines, but machines don't walk down to the supermarket to buy the goods, right?
Mhm.
That's the image that
Mhm.
we could use to simplify it a little. So they don't consume, and therefore they don't realize the profits for the capitalists. And there's no way in which you can create an economy where capitalists and workers somehow cooperate. The result of this is the financialization of the economy. And it's an inherently, it creates inherent distortions. When money is created out of nowhere and thrown at the financial markets, but also at state finances,
Mhm.
and it's employed, of course, in deficit spending, for example, to create conditions for citizens, decent conditions for people to live in. That is not part of the original formula of capitalism. That is the financialization of capitalism. It's extreme financialization. So we end up with these massive distortions. These distortions are emerging today, I would argue, they've been emerging strongly over the last few years as the devaluation of fiat currencies. Right? Fiat currencies that are no longer tied to gold. They can be created by banks out of nowhere. And that act in itself creates potentially the devaluation of currencies. And this is the phenomenon of our time. Fiat currencies are collapsing slowly but surely. And obviously what's collapsing with them is the capitalist society as well, because currencies are supposed to be stores of value. But precisely because they are fiat currencies, they are less and less stores of value. They're just money. The money can be created out of nowhere, and therefore potentially meaningless money, money with less and less value. So sorry.
No, it's okay. So why is it if the difficulty is that these robots that everyone's hiring,
Yeah.
whether it's AI or just old-fashioned robots that weld and things like that, the problem is that these robots don't receive a wage and then thereby don't purchase the consumer items that are being produced. Why wouldn't something like a universal basic income or a universal job guarantee, a wage guarantee, be the solution rather than quantitative easing? If you could just redirect the money that's being produced, or actually, I guess it would be alongside quantitative easing. You create this fictitious capital, but then you put it into the pockets of workers through a basic income, or you give everyone some sort of job, even if it's just passing papers back and forth about how the AIs are doing, then you will have the money to go and realize the value that's being produced by the
the machines have created. Well, the problem is that the problem is that not all jobs, first of all, are value producing. The production of value is strictly related to production of commodities. So that's why industrial capitalism is the sort of the highest phase of value producing capital, because there really you have workers producing commodities and then being given a salary to purchase those commodities they produced, and therefore realizing profits out of surplus value, right? That's the kind of the way in which it's supposed to work in capitalist terms. If you start by saying, okay, we let machines produce commodities as much as they want, people don't need to work anymore, they can stay at home in front of the television, but we still need to provide them with some capital to spend, right? Or at least some money to spend, to buy commodities to survive, and so on and so forth. But first of all, where does this money come from? And your point is quantitative easing. So it's already the financialization of the economy we're talking about. In a sense, we are already there. We're already at that point, right? Where there isn't enough liquidity in the system, you need to get it out. You need to get it from out of nowhere, quite literally. Quantitative easing, ultimately, it's money created out of nowhere,
Just
and then
printing money. Just
printing money is the phrase that everybody understands, right? In truth, they don't really print it anymore. They just mouse click it. They mouse click it on their computers, and then they use it to purchase assets, normally bonds like treasuries, from the market. And obviously, by purchasing those assets, they inject money into the market, right? But it doesn't come from within the system. It's not part of this kind of pseudo-natural balance or pseudo-natural connection between labor and capital. I'm saying pseudo-natural because, of course, it's not natural. It's a fiction. It's been created, but it's out of nowhere. If we go back to the origins, somebody decided this could work. This formula could work. Let's try it. And then, of course, it started to work. It took centuries. Right, for a while it overlapped with the feudal system, and so on and so forth. But it then managed to take root and to develop historically and socially, socialize the world. The problem is if we're starting to finance UBI, for example, the question is, how do we finance UBI, universal benefit, basic income? How do we finance it if we cannot finance it from the system? If there's not enough value in the system to finance, if we cannot finance it through taxation, through revenues, right? Because the idea would be, maybe we can tax the super rich or whatever to finance UBI. But there's big problems related to that. First of all, how do you chase the super rich? We know where they put their money. It's very difficult to get them to pay tax. But even that, revenues are no longer enough to reproduce our societies. Revenues alone today are merely used to cover the interest on the deficit. Unfortunately, the system is so dependent on fictitious capital created out of nowhere that it's very difficult to think of a sustainable way of having automated production in capitalist terms. The distortions are enormous. We end up with a devaluation of money. Also, don't forget that the financial sector is like a black hole. The more money you throw at it, the more money it needs to sustain itself, because these bets and side bets constantly multiply. And then they multiply into the derivative galaxy. Derivative galaxy is, nobody exactly knows how many quadrillions of dollars there are in derivatives alone. So it's really, the image of a mountain of paper built on some kind of extremely volatile substance. It's so dangerous. It's difficult to. It's also very difficult to manage it, right? And today we are seeing how difficult it is, because that's part of my argument. You constantly need these emergencies to establish some kind of balance within the system, where you can raise your rates a little bit, make money a little bit more expensive. But now we know that this is not going to work for very long. We need to find reasons to bring those interest rates down, like they did during COVID. And they will need to do that now again with this escalation of war escalation, I think. There will be some kind of incident, not necessarily a third world war. I don't think that's going to happen, but there will be an escalation, dangerous enough, and also portrayed by the media in such a way that it will convince everybody that, those measures have to be taken. And in terms of making money cheap again. Why are they making money cheap again? Because the financial system can only sustain itself through cheap money, through injections of mountains of cheap money. Sorry.
I know. You didn't digress at all. You set up a great transition, a segue, because now I think we need to, for the people who want to watch what we're going to talk about next, they need to go over to Rumble, because we're going to be talking about things that the state doesn't want us to talk about. We could talk about economics all day long and nobody cares, and it's all abstract. But now we're going to talk about how these states of emergency are constructed and why and we've gone over why. But we'll continue recording here. But everyone should know that your YouTube is under the control of the state, and because of that, we can't speak as freely here as we might want to. But you can become an enlightened wonder over. I'm sorry, I'm becoming Russell Brand. But go over onto Rumble, and you can watch the rest of it there.